Bring it on. I like that.
Hello and welcome to this Reason training tutorial. My name is David Wills and I've been a happy Reason user since way back in the early days, maybe a little, probably earlier than I'd actually want to mention, but suffice to say, I'm a big believer in this DAW. It's kind of grown up from being a synth geek's tool to being a very well-rounded and very, very capable DAW with all the bells and whistles that you might expect. Now, while there are plenty of training packages out there showing you how to use Reason, I hope that you'll find my approach to be a little different. Now, there's a statistical principle called the Pareto distribution that basically says in any given model, you can get 80% of the results from just 20% of the efforts. Maybe you've heard the 80-20 rule. Or another way to say it, while there are a million features and menu options and right-click submenus in Reason, you get the most bang for the buck from the most important 20% or so of them. I could easily spend days and days going through every single feature and function of Reason, but my experience has been that there are a smaller subset of functions that you use basically day in and day out, and the best use of your time is to absolutely nail down those features, because those features are the ones that you need to know like the back of your hand. Basically things like how to quickly record, edit, and mix tracks, how to quickly drop drum tracks down and tweak them to exactly how you like them, how to find the right sound instantly and edit it to your own taste, how to blend everything together and build a mix that you can be proud of, and then export that out to whatever file format that you want. So before we get started, let's get the lay of the land and see kind of a brief overview of what Reason is. Now, if you start up a brand new song in Reason, you'll come to a screen that looks very much like what we're looking at right now. And I would break this down into basically 5 different parts. We have our browser, we have our mixer, we have our rack, our sequencer, and our transport bar down here. Now, some of these you can see right now. You actually see here the mixer is minimized right now, and with this tooltip you can see that you can double click to maximize it out. And we have a mixer with actually no input channels, nothing is in here because we have a brand spanking new song. I can double click that bar to minimize the mixer as well. You notice there's a little icon just to the left of these various parts right here, and if you click on that, then it will open that part of the screen, not maximize it. Double click on the bar here, that will maximize it. But if you click on this, this will basically hide and then bring it back so it's sharing the screen. So we'll get into each of these ones right now, but there's a set of keyboard shortcuts that I would really recommend you getting into. I recommend learning as many keyboard shortcuts as you can, but these ones are really must-have keyboard shortcuts, and they refer to showing or hiding these 4 parts of the screen here. Don't worry about the transport bar, that's always just down there, but in fact, in terms of these 4 parts of your screen, there are keyboard shortcuts that will minimize and maximize that. So for example, the F3 will hide and show the browser. I'm just hitting F3 and it goes back and forth. If you hit F5, that will maximize or minimize, actually not minimize, but it'll basically maximize and bring that screen back to where it was. It's basically just like clicking that. So if that is F5, this is probably F6, right? Sure thing, you hit F6 and that will maximize and bring that back. And then what do you think about that? F7, right? Sequencer will do that. So I'm going to put my mouse right in the middle so you can see this is all being done by keyboard shortcuts. I'm pressing F3, hiding the browser, F5, the mixer, F6, the rack, F7, the sequencer. Now you can do keyboard shortcuts between 5, 6, and 7. So if you hold down, basically press F5 and F6, then that will share the mixer and rack together. And any combination of these will work. So F5 and F7 will share the mixer and the sequencer. F6 and F7 would share the rack and the sequencer. If you press down all 3 at once, then you'll have all of these 3 different sections just sharing the screen. So let's start with the browser down here. The browser is a way to go through your various instruments, your various effects, utilities, and players. Now, everything above here is basically, they're kind of like a virtual representation of what you would have had in a physical world in a recording studio. You'd have a drum machine, you'd have another drum machine, a synthesizer, another synth, just a general MIDI playback device, loop player, samplers, and all that kind of stuff. Then you'd also have a bunch of effects. And then there's various other utilities that can combine various things together. There's a new LFO, there's arpeggiated splitters, some mixers, there's a bunch of stuff, and some players, some really cool new players, which we'll get into there. So basically these are kind of like virtual representations of your equipment locker. You have all of this gear that you can bring into your Reason project. Now, if you don't want to go, there's basically two different routes you can go. You can either bring a machine in and then select a patch from there, or else you can go through here in some of the sounds and then you can just start cruising through there. You don't need to worry about which where this drum kit is coming from. You can just select it into your song. So there's basically two different ways to go. You can either start with the actual kind of virtual equipment and then select a patch, or just go down here and then browse through things, or of course you can just start searching things. So if I was just to select a pad, then you can see there's a whole bunch of things there, and there's a clue to what is using that by these various icons, and you'll get to know these icons after a while. But if it's not really that important to you what makes the sound, but you just want to get that kind of sound, then just search in here, and then all of these various patches will come up, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But this is a very basic introduction to what's going on over here in the browser. And then you can make favorites. If you have any refills, things like that, they'll come up here. We'll deal with that a little bit later. But do you get the idea? The browser is just a way to either select your instrument, your effect, your utilities or players first, and then select the patches within that, or else down here you can just go through the factory sounds or the Reason 9 sounds and either browse them or search them. So once we get past the browser, we get into our mixer, rack, and sequencer, and they are all related. In other words, it's very easy to understand what a mixer does, and in this case we have a mixer with no input channels here. Our rack is really kind of a virtual representation of the hardware that we would normally find in a studio. And then the sequencer, we all know what that does in terms of tracks. But if we were to just double click on this subtractor analog synthesizer, there's something that's going to happen in the mixer and the rack and the sequencer all at the same time. Have a look if you can. All of these three places, if you can see that at the same time. I'm going to hit the subtractor, I'm going to double click on it, and boom, it's done three things. We have made up an input channel here, and that has been already named bass guitar because that is the basic default patch that comes up with the subtractor here. Now, this subtractor has been placed in our rack, and a track has been made down here. So if I was just to hit record and just play something, and then stop and then play that back, so what has happened? We've recorded these MIDI notes in here. That is connected to this subtractor, which has a bass guitar brought up, and this is connected to this bass guitar over here. So we could adjust the level, and if you scroll up here, you can add effects, you can EQ, you can gate, you can compress, you can do a whole bunch of stuff there. But if you really want to be a little bit curious, if you hit the tab key, you can turn this around. You can actually see what's gone on. Remember, all I did, I went back here, I just double clicked on this subtractor analog synthesizer, and all of these things happen. The output of this went into this mix channel, and then this is connected to this mixer channel over here. If you never want to peek out around the back of this rack, you don't have to. Just hit tab again and don't worry about it. There's a lot of creativity you can do, but if you just want to bring in patches, you can just do that. And so you see the relationship between everything. We have track playing a sound source going through a mixer channel. So let's briefly look at the transport bar. Now the transport bar should be pretty clear to most of you who have used DAWs or sequencers or even drum machines for that matter. All of this is fairly self-explanatory, but we'll go through it from left to right. Up here we have keys. We can have on-screen keys where you can play whatever track you have selected. So in this case, you can play that with your on-screen keyboard here, or if you hit computer keys, you can actually use your QWERTY keyboard, and you can see these mappings taking place right here. We have a groove mixer, which we'll get into when we talk about quantizing in detail. And speaking of quantizing, you can quantize in record mode, on the fly as you go. This is basically correcting your timing to this particular subdivision, 16th notes or 8th note triplets, anything you like. Then you can sync mode can either be internal, that'll be the selection you normally work with. If you're trying to sync up to another DAW or an external MIDI clock, that's where you can set that here. Here is your current song locator position, and you can see that that's either in bars, beats, or down here in actually a time position. And just while I'm here, if you're moving this around, then you can see obviously that changing here, and you can snap to the nearest bar or quarter note or anything like that. If I hit bar, then it will just snap. I can't select anything in between, it'll go straight there. If I was selecting that to 8th notes, then it will click down to the various 8th notes, and you can see that reflected down here. Then we can have our click, we can have that on or off, and you can also have a pre-count on or off, and that is actually selected up in, well, I'll show you that a little bit later on, but basically a pre-count off, you can select that there, or whether your click is on or off as well. Your tempo, if you like, you can hit tap, and that will average out your last, I think, 4, which will give you that BPM right there. You can set up a time signature, and then you can rewind, fast forward, stop, play. If you hit stop twice, it will go back to the very beginning, and we can hit record. This has got to do with lanes. We'll discuss that when we're recording. We won't worry about that right now. And then you can set up a loop that will loop between your left and right measure markers right here, and you can see that that is changing down here. So if you wanted to say loop between measure 2 and measure 4, you can set up here, set that, put your loop on, and then that will just loop around and around and around. So this is a very fast overview of what's going on. We'll get into all this details later, but from what we've learned in the last few minutes is we have our browser, mixer, rack, sequencer, and transport bar down here. And like I said, get really used to those keyboard shortcuts, particularly F5, F6, F7, to maximize and minimize and share these various parts of the screen.